December 2024. The waters off the coast of Australia. A fishing vessel drifts silently in the darkness, its engines dead, its crew desperate. To any passing ship, it would look like just another maritime mishap, a boat in distress, waiting for rescue. But this was no ordinary fishing trip. Hidden in the hull of that vessel was something far more valuable than any catch of the day. 2.34 metric tons of pure cocaine. Street value, $760 million. The largest cocaine seizure in Australian history, and the beginning of the end for one of the country's most powerful criminal organizations. This is the story of Operation Tyrrendor, a story of greed, betrayal, and the sophisticated criminal networks that operate in the shadows of society. A story that exposed the deep connections between organized crime syndicates and outlaw motorcycle gangs, and a story that ended with 13 arrests, including one of the most shocking captures in Australian law enforcement history, the vice president of the Comancheros motorcycle club. But it all started with a broken engine and a phone call that should never have been made. For months, the Australian Federal Police had been tracking intelligence about a major drug importation operation. Whispers of a massive cocaine shipment coming from South America. Chatter about boats, coordinates, rendezvous points in international waters. The kind of operation that required serious planning, serious connections, and serious money. This wasn't street-level dealing. This was industrial-scale drug trafficking, the kind that floods entire cities with narcotics, destroys thousands of lives, and generates profits that rival legitimate multinational corporations. The AFP knew something big was coming. They just didn't know when, where, or how big it would actually be. Intelligence agencies had been monitoring communication networks for months. Encrypted messages, coded phone calls, suspicious financial transactions moving through offshore accounts. The criminals thought they were being careful. They used burner phones, changed SIM cards frequently, spoke in code. They believed their operation was invisible, that they had covered every angle, anticipated every risk. But modern law enforcement has tools that would have seemed like science fiction just a decade ago. Pattern recognition algorithms, international cooperation between police agencies spanning multiple continents, satellite surveillance, financial tracking systems that can follow money through a dozen shell companies across as many countries, and most importantly, patience. The AFP knew that rushing in too early would spook the organization, cause them to scatter, abandon the shipment, and disappear. So they watched, they listened, they waited. The plan was elaborate and had been in the works for over a year. A fishing vessel would be used as the transport ship, the perfect cover. Fishing boats regularly operate far from shore, stay out for extended periods, and their movements don't typically raise suspicion. The cocaine would be loaded onto the vessel somewhere in the Pacific, transferred from a larger cargo ship during a carefully timed rendezvous in international waters where no single nation's law enforcement had jurisdiction. Then the fishing boat would make its way back to Australian waters, where the drugs would be offloaded to smaller vessels or brought directly to shore under cover of darkness. Once on land, the cocaine would be distributed through established networks controlled by the Comancheros and other criminal organizations. It was a plan that had worked before for other syndicates, a plan worth the enormous risk because of the astronomical profits involved. $760 million. That kind of money could fund an entire criminal empire for years. But then something went wrong, catastrophically wrong. The fishing vessel's engine failed. Out in open water, miles from shore, the boat was dead in the water. And with every hour that passed, the risk grew exponentially. The crew couldn't just call for help through official channels that would bring the Coast Guard questions, inspections. They couldn't abandon ship. The cocaine was too valuable, and leaving it would mean losing everything, plus facing the wrath of the people who'd funded the operation. They were trapped, stranded with over 2 tons of cocaine and no way to complete their mission. Panic set in. Desperate calls were made to their contacts on shore. The organization scrambled to figure out a solution, and every one of those panicked communications was being intercepted by the AFP. This was the break law enforcement had been waiting for. The moment of vulnerability when criminals make mistakes, when the carefully constructed plan falls apart and desperation takes over. The AFP moved quickly but strategically. They coordinated with maritime authorities, positioned vessels to intercept, and assembled arrest teams across multiple locations, because they knew this wasn't just about seizing drugs. It was about dismantling the entire network, from the people on the boat to the coordinators on shore to the high-level organized crime figures who had financed and orchestrated the whole operation. This was their chance to strike at the heart of one of Australia's most dangerous criminal organizations. When authorities intercepted the fishing vessel, the scene was almost surreal. The crew knew it was over. There was no escape, no cover story that would explain away 2.34 tons of cocaine. Some tried to maintain their innocence, claiming they didn't know what was in the cargo, that they were just fishermen hired for a job. But the evidence was overwhelming. The cocaine was expertly packaged, packaged, professionally concealed. This was no amateur operation. The drugs had been carefully hidden throughout the vessel, in compartments designed specifically for smuggling, in spaces that would have been impossible to detect without thorough searching. The level of sophistication was remarkable. These weren't opportunistic criminals. They were professionals working within a highly organized network. The seizure of the drugs was just the beginning. The AFP had been building a comprehensive case for months. They had names, locations, communication records, financial trails. They knew who had organized the shipment, who had financed it, who was waiting to receive it, and who would distribute it once it reached Australian shores. And now they were ready to take down the entire operation in one coordinated strike. Arrest teams were deployed across multiple cities simultaneously. Homes were raided, businesses were searched, bank accounts were frozen, and the arrests began. 13 people were taken into custody. Drug traffickers, money launderers, logistics coordinators, enforcers. Each person played a specific role in the operation, but one arrest stood out above all the others and sent shockwaves through Australia's underworld and law enforcement community alike. The vice president of the Comancheros motorcycle club, one of the most senior members of one of the country's most notorious outlaw motorcycle gangs. His arrest confirmed what authorities had long suspected, but struggled to prove, that the lines between traditional organized crime and outlaw motorcycle clubs had completely blurred. That these groups were no longer just involved in street-level violence and local drug dealing. They were operating sophisticated international drug trafficking operations worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The Comancheros have a long and violent history in Australia. Founded in the 1962, they've been involved in numerous criminal enterprises, drug trafficking, money laundering, extortion, violence, even murder. But this arrest revealed something even more concerning. It showed that they had evolved, that they had connections to international drug cartels, that they had the resources, the expertise, and the audacity to attempt importing over 2 tons of cocaine in a single shipment. The vice president's involvement wasn't peripheral. He was a key player in organizing and financing the operation. His arrest meant that one of the highest-ranking members of one of Australia's most powerful criminal organizations would face justice for one of the largest drug importation attempts in the nation's history. The investigation revealed the staggering scope of the criminal network. The cocaine had originated in South America, likely Colombia or Peru, where it had been produced in clandestine laboratories controlled by major drug cartels. It had been transported thousands of miles across the Pacific Ocean, coordinated through multiple intermediaries, each taking their cut of the profits. The financial infrastructure alone was impressive. Money had been moved through legitimate businesses, offshore accounts, cryptocurrency transactions, and physical cash smuggling. Millions of dollars had been spent just organizing this single shipment. The return on investment, if successful, would have been enormous. $760 million worth of cocaine flooding Australian streets, generating profits that would have funded the criminal organization for years to come. But it didn't succeed. Operation Tyrrendor was a complete success for law enforcement and a devastating blow to organized crime in Australia. The seizure of 2.34 tons of cocaine, the largest in the nation's history, represented not just a financial loss, but a massive disruption to the drug supply chain. The arrest of 13 people, including the Comancheros vice president, decapitated a major criminal network. The intelligence gathered during the investigation provided invaluable information about international drug trafficking routes, communication methods, financial networks, and the connections between Australian organized crime and international cartels. It was a victory that would resonate for years. The legal proceedings that followed were extensive and closely watched. The evidence was overwhelming: the physical drugs, the intercepted communications, the financial records, testimony from cooperating witnesses, forensic analysis of phones and computers, surveillance footage, and more. The defendants faced serious charges: drug trafficking on a commercial scale, conspiracy, participation in a criminal organization, money laundering. The penalties were severe: decades in prison, life sentences for some, assets seized and forfeited, families destroyed, criminal impieties dismantled. For the Comancheros, the arrest of their vice president was a humiliating and damaging blow. It exposed their involvement in high-level drug trafficking. It provided authorities with unprecedented insight into their operations. And it demonstrated that no matter how powerful or well-connected a criminal organization might be, law enforcement could still bring them down. The reverberations were felt throughout Australia's underworld. Other criminal groups became more cautious, more paranoid. Some operations were abandoned, others were delayed. The seizure had created uncertainty and fear in a world that thrives on confidence and secrecy. But the story of Operation Tyrrendor is about more than just one successful drug bust. It's about the ongoing battle between law enforcement and organized crime. It's about the evolution of criminal networks that now operate on a global global scale with resources and sophistication that rival legitimate corporations. It's about the devastating impact of drugs on communities, the addiction, the violence, the destruction of lives and families. 2.34 tons of cocaine. If it had reached the streets, it would have been divided into millions of individual doses, millions of opportunities for addiction, millions of moments of misery for users and their families, countless overdoses, countless crimes committed by addicts desperate for their next fix. Violence between dealers fighting over territory and profits. The ripple effects of that one shipment would have been catastrophic. The $760 million street value represents more than just money. It represents human suffering on an unimaginable scale. Every gram of that cocaine was destined to destroy someone's life. Every sale would have funded further criminal activity. Every dollar of profit would have strengthened organizations that thrive on violence and corruption. The seizure didn't just take drugs off the street. It prevented immeasurable harm. It saved lives. It disrupted a network that had caused untold damage. And it sent a clear message. Australia's borders are not open for business to international drug cartels. The AFP and partner agencies involved in Operation Tyrrendor demonstrated exceptional skill, patience, and coordination. International cooperation was crucial, sharing intelligence with law enforcement agencies in other countries, tracking the movement of drugs and money across borders, coordinating surveillance and interdiction efforts across vast distances. The operation required months of painstaking work, thousands of hours of analysis, and flawless execution when the moment came to strike. It showed that when law enforcement agencies work together, sharing resources and intelligence, they can take down even the most sophisticated criminal networks. Today, the cocaine seized in Operation Tyrrendor has been destroyed. The 13 people arrested are facing justice in Australian courts. The Comancheros and other criminal organizations involved have been dealt a significant blow, but the war on drugs continues. New shipments are being planned, new routes are being established, new criminals are stepping up to fill the void left by those arrested. The battle never truly ends. But operations like Tyrrendor prove that law enforcement can win significant victories, that criminal organizations are not invincible, that patience, intelligence, and coordination can overcome even the most elaborate criminal schemes. The story of Operation Tyrrendor will be studied by law enforcement agencies around the world as an example of how to successfully disrupt major drug trafficking operations. It will be remembered as the largest cocaine seizure in Australian history, and it will serve as a warning to any criminal organization considering Australia as a destination for their drugs. The risk is not worth the reward. The AFP is watching, the borders are protected, and eventually, no matter how sophisticated the operation, justice will prevail. The fishing vessel that broke down in international waters became the scene of one of the greatest law enforcement victories in Australian history. And the criminals who thought they were about to make $760 million instead found themselves facing decades behind bars. Their empire shattered, their future destroyed. Operation Tyrrendor, a success story for law enforcement,